Hello and welcome to the third of 6 webinars in the Frequently Asked Practice Queries series. This video will be focused on questions related to cross-jurisdictional practice. If you have not already done so, I invite you to watch the introductory video in this series. It'll help you make sense of the information and perspectives offered in this and future webinars. I'm Judith Pinto, Occupational Therapist and Practice Advisor with the Alberta College of Occupational Therapists. I'm grateful to be recording this today in Edmonton, Alberta. Situated on the North Saskatchewan River, this land has been home to Indigenous communities, primarily the Cree, Blackfoot, Assiniboine, and Métis, for thousands of years. Edmonton is located in Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. The image on the screen is of the Rossdale Cemetery, a memorial built to mark traditional burial grounds on the Rossdale Flats. This land used to be part of EPCOR's power plant site until remains were found. A section of that site was then blocked off. The City of Edmonton, EPCOR, descendants of traditional bands of the area, and other community members came together to create this memorial, which was officially opened in 2006. Registrants who call in with a cross-jurisdictional practice question are usually asking whether they can work virtually with a client who's physically located somewhere other than in Alberta. Or they may be asking whether they can be physically located outside of Alberta and continue to provide virtual care to their Alberta-based clients. ACOT also receives phone calls from OTs registered in other Canadian provinces asking whether they're able to provide services to clients physically located in Alberta. All of these situations are cross-jurisdictional issues. The typical cross-jurisdictional practice question goes along the lines of, can I see a client who lives someplace other than in Alberta? So our example is my client is moving to Ontario. I have been asked to continue to provide OT services to them after they move. Can I do this? So we're clear on what the therapist wants to do. And in terms of triage, this is well within ACOT's mandate to regulate the practice of occupational therapy in Alberta. So we can proceed to step 2. Now, there are many things that we don't know in this situation, and we will get more clear as we begin. So in step 2, registrants might be invited to do a gut check. What is their hunch? Are they leaning yes or no? What concerns or questions come to mind? You might want to take a moment, press pause on this video, and jot down some initial thoughts. Remember, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. In our example, an ACOT-registered OT is looking to provide services to someone who will be living outside of Alberta. We need to address the need to understand legal and regulatory expectations as a self-regulated health professional, whether the interest in providing virtual care to clients outside of Alberta is based on the client request, or perhaps the therapist's interest in expanding their business and client base. So in step 3, from an ACOT guidance perspective, we look at legislation. Are there federal or provincial laws that could be relevant? In the case of cross-jurisdictional practice, with the exception of the 3 northern territories, Yukon, Northwest Territory, and Nunavut, all provinces have both generic health professional legislation, like Alberta's Health Professions Act and the Health Profession Restricted Activity Regulation, and occupational therapy specific regulation, like the Alberta's Occupational Therapy Profession Regulation. These require licensing with designated regulatory bodies. In step 4, we will take a look at regulations. Standard of Practice, Accountability, and Professional Responsibility 1A states that a registrant maintains current registration with the Alberta College of Occupational Therapists in accordance with the requirements outlined in the Health Professions Act, the Occupational Therapist Profession Regulation, ACOT bylaws, and applicable registration policies. This includes taking responsibility for determining and documenting if registration in another jurisdiction, within Canada or internationally, is required or not when providing virtual services, either from that jurisdiction to clients physically located in Alberta, or from Alberta to clients physically located in another jurisdiction. The Standard of Practice Documentation and Record Retention, 3B, states that a registrant documents within the client record details of the service provision process, such as the details including mode of service delivery, whether that's in person or virtual. And Standard of Practice Risk Management and Safety, 3D, states A registrant identifies risks in practice and incorporates measures to mitigate or manage those risks. Risks include, but are not limited to, risks relevant to mode of service delivery, whether that's in-person or virtual, and 3F, breaches of client privacy or confidentiality. ACOT's Code of Ethics, Responsibilities to Client, states that a registrant is responsible to incorporate risk management approaches in service provision as appropriate for the client's priorities, needs, and circumstances, and the practice situation. In addition, I encourage you to review the Association of Canadian Occupational Therapists Regulatory Organization, or COTRO's, Memorandum of Understanding on Cross-Jurisdictional Practice, and the Practice FAQ, Registration Requirements for Practice Across Jurisdiction, and the Practice Guideline, Considerations for Virtual Practice. These three documents provide clear guidelines that ACOT registered OTs can provide care to a client in Ontario, so long as they meet minimum expectations for both ACOT and the College of Occupational Therapists of Ontario, so long as they have appropriate coverage through their professional liability insurance provider and meet minimum expectations as outlined in the standards and code of both colleges. In step 5, we begin with the consideration of what is the practice of occupational therapy. Are you able to offer virtual care across jurisdiction in a way that aligns with the practice of occupational therapy as defined under the Health Professions Act? Are you competent to do so? Are you competent in virtual practice and all that means? Managing the technology at your end, supporting clients with the technology at their end, addressing confidentiality, documentation, informed consent, including the risks, benefits, and alternatives to virtual and cross-jurisdictional care. Is your employer aligned with this expectation, and does your practice align with their policies and procedures? In the case of our example, in addition to all that we've already discussed, the therapist would also need to be able to offer occupational therapy services in a competent manner, aligned with their employer expectations, policies, and procedures, and they must obtain informed consent from their client, having reviewed the risks, benefits, and alternatives to working with a therapist who is not registered in the jurisdiction where the client will be physically located. If they were in private practice, they would be well advised to ensure that they have policies and procedures in place to address their decision-making and implementation, taking into account all that we've discussed to this point. In step 6, an ethical check. While there are not necessarily purely ethical issues here, there may be conflict of interest issues at play, and I encourage you to review the previous conflict of interest webinar. Specifically, there could be competing allegiances between a therapist wanting to expand their private practice and the best interest of the client, who may be better served by working with a therapist who is either in person or at least physically located in their province so that in-person sessions are potentially possible. These considerations need to be explored as you establish collaboratively with your client how to proceed and how you address those in the best interest of your client. Again, I'm referring you to the conflict of interest webinar for more on this. In this case, there could be a conflict of interest at play. The client may be better served by finding a therapist who is able to meet them in person rather than working with a therapist despite their familiarity and history virtually. This needs to be considered in the therapist's decision-making process. If they've already been working virtually, perhaps this would be more of a continuity of care issue and might help to be a stabilizing influence for the client. But it also may be true that there may be some benefits to establishing a new relationship with a new therapist. In step 7, the therapist has probably arrived at a preliminary decision based on ACOT guidance, but by this point, they may have enough information and recognize that they can proceed, but perhaps need more guidance to consider whether they should. In this example, the therapist decides that based on the review of legislation, regulations, practice of OT, their competence, their employer's policies and procedures, they could provide ongoing virtual care to the client. Certainly the new Memorandum of Understanding signed by the Association of Canadian Occupational Therapy Regulatory Organizations allows for ACOT registered OTs to practice virtually to residents of Ontario. So there are good reasons to provide care, but they might need more information. And steps 8 through 10 are really where the therapist needs to independently consider their situation. So context in step 8. In the case of cross-jurisdictional practice issues, are there limited access to the resources or the specific skill set that the therapist provides in Ontario? Or is there a pre-existing therapeutic relationship that would be appropriate to maintain in the best interest of the client? Or is the employer needing the therapist to provide this service? In our example, the therapist has a pre-existing relationship and has a unique skill set that would be more challenging for the therapist to find for the client in their rural community setting in Ontario. So in this case, it may well be in the client's best interest to continue. Ideally, this is discussed with the client so that they can arrive at a collaborative decision and the client is able to offer truly informed consent. It may be a reasonable decision as well to continue to provide services just until that client is able to find a therapist who is physically located in Ontario who could pick up care. It may even be that the client in Ontario is working with their Ontario-based OT virtually, but there is at least a possibility for in-person services should that be necessary. By step 9, ideally, if there's any uncertainties that would need to be addressed, legal, ethical, clinical consultations or consultations with others could be helpful. Mentorship to address improving competence in relevant areas may also be a consideration. In the case of our example, a therapist wanting to provide ongoing services to a current client moving to Ontario calls their PLI provider to confirm insurance coverage, reviews relevant Ontario legislation and regulations, and contacts CODO, the College of Occupational Thearists of Ontario, to ensure that they have understood things clearly. They ensure that they are meeting minimum standards by reviewing standards of practice and code of ethics for both ACOT and CODO. And finally, in step 10, once a decision has been made, the therapist will need to consider whether everyone's needs and perspectives have been considered and accounted for. If there are limitations or consequences, how might they address them? The therapist needs, again, to be confident in their decision, understand why they have made their choice, and be clear on how they will manage potential pitfalls. Ultimately, the decision rests with the therapist. I hope the information presented has been helpful as you consider opportunities for cross-jurisdictional practice. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out by phone or email.